The temperature gauge on Nora's cracked phone screen read -11 degrees when she pulled the ventilation shaft hatch closed above her and started down the ladder. The wind had been driving out of the northwest since before dawn, the kind that comes off high peaks with real intent, not incidentally cold, but deliberately so, and by mid-afternoon it had pushed the valley temperature past the point where her sleeping bag would do much of anything useful. She had stood at the surface long enough to confirm it, watching low cloud flatten itself against the ridgeline to the north, feeling the wind work through the seams of her jacket, and then she had put her boot on the first rung and counted her way down. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to 48 feet, 12 rungs on the upper section, then the platform bend, then 10 more to the passage floor. She counted them every time, the way she had learned to count things when she was very young and the world had too many moving parts and not enough solid ones. At the bottom, the passage opened south and the wind stopped existing entirely. She unhooked the lantern from her pack, struck the lighter, and hung it from the iron bolt in the east wall. The bolt was decades old, set into the rock by someone who had needed a hook in the dark, someone who was almost certainly long gone from this mountain now. The light spread through the upper passage in a wide amber circle and made the rough stone walls look warmer than they were. 43 degrees down here. She had a small thermometer clipped to her pack, and she checked it twice a day out of habit. 43 was cold enough to make your breath visible and cold enough to keep her hands stiff in the mornings, but it was also 31 degrees warmer than what was happening on the other side of that ladder, and that was the only arithmetic that mattered right now. She sat on the plywood sheet she had laid out 2 days ago, pulled off her work gloves, and blew on her fingers until they stopped feeling distant from the rest of her. She ate the last protein bar from the day's supply slowly and without looking at it, and watched the lantern flame move in some air current she could not feel on her skin. This was her third night sleeping in the Hargrove Mine. She was 18 years old. She owned every inch of the 280 acres above her head. She had $22.14 in her jacket pocket, and 60 days remaining to come up with $29,400 in back taxes before the county repossessed the property and handed it to someone who had no business with it. Before we get into the rest of this story, make sure to smash that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have an extra special story that is going to completely blow your mind. Nora Vance had been carrying her own weight for as long as she could remember, which was approximately since the age of 4, which was the age at which children in difficult situations either begin adapting or begin suffering, and Nora had chosen the first option out of something that was less survival instinct than plain stubbornness. She had not chosen her circumstances. She had chosen how to move through them, and that was the only choice she had ever been reliably given. She was born in Butte, Montana, on a January night in a county hospital that ran its heating system on something close to optimism during the worst weeks of winter. Her mother was 23 years old and alone and had driven herself to the hospital through a blizzard that closed the highway the following morning. The nurses who were on that shift remembered Charlotte Vance because she was quiet during labor in a way that was not composure, but something more deliberate than composure, and because she sent the social worker away the next morning, telling the woman she had a plan and was fine. Charlotte was not fine. She had been running from something for longer than the nurses knew, and the plan she held on to was the kind of plan that depends on circumstances beyond your own control, fragile in the specific way of plans built by someone who has no other options. Nora's mother died on a state highway outside of Glendive when Nora was 3 years old. A semi-truck crossed the center line at 4 in the morning, and Charlotte's car went into the ditch beside the road. She did not come back out. Nora was with the neighbor woman at the time, a gray-haired woman named Bess who watched her sometimes and who called the county when the call came about Charlotte because she did not know what else to do. The county came and took Nora away, and that was the last time Nora Vance lived anywhere she could call home without qualification. She went through 6 foster placements between the ages of 3 and 15. Not all of them were bad, which was worth saying because it was easy to make the story simpler than it was. The Henleys in Missoula were decent people who ran a household of 5 foster children with the efficient fairness of parents who had thought seriously about what fairness required. They were not warm, but they were reliable, which in Nora's experience was worth more than warmth that arrived and departed on schedules you couldn't predict. The Walcotts in Billings had a yard with fruit trees and a dog named Bernard who slept on Nora's feet during cold months. And for 2 years, she was almost something she might have described as settled. But fostering ended for reasons, usually administrative reasons, and Nora moved when the reasons arrived. She packed whatever fit in her school bag and left the rest. After the second time, she stopped accumulating anything she could not carry. The last placement was with a woman named Darlene Fuchs in Great Falls, who was not unkind and who ran her household with the predictability of a railroad schedule. Nora lived with Darlene from 15 to 18 and learned, over those 3 years, to make herself useful and to occupy exactly the space she was given and no more. She fixed things around the house. Leaky faucets, sticky door hinges, the back step that had been rotting since before she arrived. She cooked when Darlene worked late. She learned how to read a circuit breaker and change a light fixture and replace a cracked window pane from a home repair book she checked out of the Great Falls Public Library so many times that the librarian eventually set it aside on a special shelf with Nora's name written on a slip of paper tucked inside the front cover. On the morning of her 18th birthday, Darlene had a grocery store cake and a gift card to the sporting goods store, and she sat across from Nora at the kitchen table and told her in a voice that was gentle but clear that she wanted Nora to know she had been a genuine pleasure to have, truly. But that state support ended on Nora's birthday, and Darlene was going to need the room back by the end of the month because her sister's daughter was moving down from Helena and needed a place. Nora told her it was all right. She meant it. She had known this was coming in the way you know things that have been true for a long time before they are spoken out loud. She had saved $640 from odd jobs over 2 years, cash work, shoveling driveways and cleaning out garages and helping people move furniture. She had a 1999 Dodge Neon with 212,000 miles on it that she had bought from a neighbor for $450. She had her clothes, her tools, the home repair book she had eventually purchased her own copy of for $3 at a library sale, and one other thing. A photograph. Small, faded at the edges, the kind of square print that older cameras produced. She kept it in her wallet, between 2 worn cards she never used. The photograph showed her mother standing on rocky terrain in front of something industrial, a structure of some kind, dark timber and iron, out of focus in the background because the camera had been pointed at Charlotte and not at the landscape behind her. Charlotte was maybe 20 years old in the picture, laughing at whoever held the camera, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. The sky was that specific deep blue that belongs to Montana in summer at altitude. Nora had looked at that photograph 10,000 times. She had never been able to identify the structure behind her mother clearly enough to know what it was or where it had been taken. She had held the print under a lamp, used her phone to photograph it, and zoom in on the background. The image was too small and too faded to give her anything conclusive. What she had was her mother laughing in front of something she could not name. She had no other family. The state's files listed her father as unknown. Charlotte's family, if there had been any, had not come forward when the accident happened and the county took the child, and whatever trail existed had gone cold in the years since. Nora left Great Falls on a Wednesday in early spring with the Neon's windows down because the car ran hot and the heater worked on only one setting, which was a temperature best described as inadvisable. She was following a rumor. She had picked it up at a diner in Lewistown from a man 3 stools down who had told her that a logging operation near a town called Copperhead was hiring seasonal workers at $18 an hour. Cash, no experience required. He'd said it with the confidence of someone passing along secondhand information, and Nora had known it was probably thinner than it sounded, but thin information in a particular direction was still a direction, and she drove toward it. The Neon's radiator cracked on a long uphill grade 4 miles short of Copperhead. Steam rose from under the hood in a heavy white column, and Nora pulled onto the gravel shoulder and sat with her hands in her lap for a while, watching it disperse in the pine-scented air. The mountains ahead were enormous, the kind of scale that makes a broken-down car and one young woman seem like things you could miss if you weren't looking specifically. She sat there for a few minutes and then got out and started walking. Copperhead, Montana, had been incorporated in 1922 and had never since been confused with anywhere significant. It sat in a wide valley between 2 ridgelines at an elevation where winters lasted and summers arrived briefly, and with the brilliant urgency of things that know they won't last long. Main Street ran 4 blocks and held a hardware store, a diner called Patty's Place, a post office roughly the size of a large walk-in closet, a gas station, and a bar called the Copper Tap that opened 6 days a week and was genuinely busy on 4 of them. 3 churches stood within 2 blocks of each other at the north end of town, which said something about the community's particular approach to uncertainty. The last census had counted 1,780 people. Most longtime residents figured the real number now was lower than that, by a meaningful margin. The logging operation Nora had driven toward did not exist in any active form. Either the man in Lewistown had been misinformed, or it had closed, or it had never quite been what he described. It did not matter. The neon was 4 miles back and needed a new radiator that she could not currently provide, and Nora understood, practically and without self-pity, when a situation had become fixed and the question had shifted from what do I do next to what do I do here. She found work within 2 days of arriving. Patty Reed, who owned the diner and opened it herself every morning at 6 and closed it herself most nights, hired Nora to clean the kitchen and do dishes for $7 an hour in cash, which was below the legal minimum, and they both knew it. But the work was immediate, and the arrangement required no paperwork. Walt Gruber at the hardware store hired her for 20 hours a week after discovering that she could restock shelves twice as fast as the teenager he'd had before her and could also read a bin label correctly the first time. She helped 2 families move furniture in her first month, after word got around that she was available for that kind of work and did not need to be managed. Walt had a storage shed behind the store, 8 by 12 feet, uninsulated, with a single outlet and a space heater that tripped the breaker if you pushed it too hard in cold weather. He cleared out the extra inventory and offered it to her for $80 a month deducted from her wages. She had a cot, a milk crate for a nightstand, and she ran an extension cord across the floor from the outlet. It was not good. For $80 a month in the Montana foothills at the start of winter, it was available, and available was what she had to work with. Gus Dalton was the first person in Copperhead who talked to her like she was worth talking to without needing anything from her in exchange. He was 71 years old and had the slow deliberateness of someone who had learned long ago that most things worth saying could wait until you found the right words. He stopped by the hardware store every Thursday afternoon and always talked to Nora while she worked, telling her things about the valley that no one else bothered telling newcomers, because most newcomers didn't stay. He knew which birds came through in October and which creek water was safe to drink and the specific quality of light on the ridge peaks in late afternoon at the end of August. He knew these things the way people know landscapes they have spent a life inside. He had worked the Hargrove Mine for 22 years, from 1967 until it closed in 1989. He talked about it the way retired miners talk about their mines, with the particular combination of pride and grief that belongs to work that was hard and necessary and is now gone. He said the Hargroves had been fair employers by the standards of the time and the industry, which was not the highest available praise, but it was sincere. He said the mine had been a real operation, not a marginal claim, but a genuine producer, silver and copper in quantities that had kept the valley working through decades when other places had given up and emptied out. He told her, in a lower voice one Thursday in September, that the closure had not been entirely what the official record described. The partial collapse, the safety remediation, the whole account of how the Hargrove Mine ended had another layer to it that most people in town knew about in outline, if not in detail. There was a name, he said, that came up too many times in too many convenient places in the months before the mine closed. A man on the county mining authority, Marcus Stonebridge. He'd had an interest in the land adjacent to Hargrove Mountain, and he had friends in the county surveyor's office, and he had moved carefully and through official channels so that everything he did looked like procedure, looked like regulation, looked like the ordinary function of county government, until you stepped back and looked at the whole picture at once. Robert Hargrove had looked at the whole picture and had spent 3 years trying to get anyone else to look at it with him. He filed legal challenges in 1990 and 1991. He died in 1993 before anything came of them, and the fight died with him. There was one other thing Gus told her, in pieces over several Thursdays, not in a straight line, but in the circling way that people approach the parts of a story that still have weight in them. He said that in the summer of 1988, Robert Hargrove had come into the mine on a Monday morning with a different quality to him than usual. Not excited exactly. more like a man carrying something heavy that he had not yet decided what to do with. Gus could not have named what he'd seen in Robert's face that morning if you had asked him directly, but he said it was the look of a man who had found something he wasn't ready to have yet. 2 weeks later, the expanded drilling permit applications appeared on the County Mining Authority agenda for review. 3 months after that, the permits were still in committee and Robert Hargrove stopped talking about them at all. Nora filed all of this away. She was good at filing things away and returning to them when the right moment arrived. The people of Copperhead regarded her with the range of responses that small towns produce towards someone who arrives without explanation and stays past the point when a stranger should have moved along. Some people were genuinely decent about it. Patty left food at the end of the shift without being asked, soup or pie or whatever had not sold, sat at the counter's end without comment or expectation. Jerome at the library found her the books and records she asked for without questioning why she wanted them. Old Calvin Marsh, who ran the gas station, let her use the shop's tool bay one Saturday to work on the Neon's radiator with borrowed equipment. And when it turned out the radiator was beyond what she could repair with the tools available, he did not make her feel any particular way about it. Others were the way small towns can be toward people who arrive without credentials. The women who came into Patty's for morning coffee and occupied the booth by the window looked through Nora as though she were furniture they had already assessed and dismissed. The men at the copper tap, when she went in on cold evenings for a hot meal, talked about her in voices pitched carefully between directness and privacy, not quite loud enough to be an address, but not quiet enough to be a private conversation. She heard what they said. She heard all of it. One evening in late September she was sitting at the bar with a bowl of soup when 2 men in the booth behind her were talking about the girl who was living in Walt Gruber's shed, and one of them said that it was a particular kind of person who drifted into a place like Copperhead and then just stayed because they had nowhere better to drift to, and the other one agreed that there was a reason some people never put down roots anywhere, and the first one said something about what that reason usually was. She heard every word. She finished her soup and left a tip she could not reasonably afford and walked back to the shed in the dark. She was not going to argue with them. She had learned a long time ago that defending yourself in those conversations only provided more material for the next one. You held your position and waited for the weather to shift. She had been holding her position fine until the last Wednesday of October, when Walt came to find her in the back of the store and told her he had received an offer on the property, the store and the shed both, from a buyer in Fielding who intended to convert the space. He needed her out by November 1st. He handed her the $80 for October back, folded in a receipt, and apologized twice in a way that was genuine and that she appreciated. November 1st was 11 days away. She sat with the arithmetic. She had $260 saved after 8 months of working 2 jobs, which was what remained after food and a pair of work boots and the replacement element for the space heater. The available rentals in Copperhead were the apartments above the laundromat and the double-wide on the edge of town that the Kirby family was asking $800 a month for. None of those numbers led anywhere useful from where she was standing. It was the Thursday after Walt told her, sitting at Patty's counter after the lunch rush with her coffee going cold in front of her, that she saw the notice on the county bulletin board next to the register. Yellow paper, printed, the kind of thing you walk past without stopping unless something in the specific arrangement of words catches you. She read it once and took a photograph with her phone. Public Tax Lien Auction, County of Harlan, November 3rd, 10 a.m. Harlan County Clerk's Office, Fielding, MT, Properties in Default of County Tax Obligations. Starting bids from $1. The library was open Thursday evenings. Nora walked over and sat at one of the 2 public computers for 2 hours, reading through the county's property records database with the auction catalog Jerome had printed for her without being asked. Most of the listings were what you would expect from a tax lien auction in a rural county. Old acreages, residential lots, places that had been in families for generations and ended up legally stranded when the last person who knew what to do with them died. She read through them looking for something that was not expensive to maintain and not a complete ruin and not owned by someone in a position to contest the sale after the fact. The last entry in the catalog stopped her entirely. Parcel 14A, Hargrove Mining Claim, Hargrove Mountain. 280 acres, inclusive of all surface and subsurface structures as currently standing, inclusive of full mineral rights. Tax arrears of $29,400. Starting bid, $1. She stared at that entry for a long time. She pulled up the county's historical property records, and then the state mining registry, and then the library's archive index, which held scanned copies of old documents that had been donated or transferred over the years from county offices and private collections. She read for 90 minutes without stopping. The Hargrove Mine claim dated to 1941, when Edward Hargrove had filed on 280 acres of what was then unclaimed land and begun excavation that summer. The mine had produced silver and copper in genuine quantities for nearly 50 years, enough to sustain the Hargrove family and employ several dozen men through decades when the valley had little else. In late 1988, the County Mining Authority's meeting minutes showed that Hargrove Mining Incorporated had submitted applications for expanded drilling permits to pursue deposits at depth. Those applications had entered committee review and had not emerged. In March of 1989, the county had recorded an event described as partial collapse of the main shaft entrance at the Hargrove Mine claim, following which the mine was closed pending safety remediation. The Hargrove family had challenged the closure twice, in 1990 and in 1991. Robert Hargrove, listed as the sole director of Hargrove Mining Incorporated, had died in October of 1993. The legal challenges had lapsed with him. No subsequent heir had come forward to claim the estate. The property had been in administrative limbo ever since, a 280-acre mineral claim sitting on a Montana mountainside with back taxes accumulating year by year and no one living to pay them. She thought about what Gus had told her about Marcus Stonebridge on the County Mining Authority. She thought about the drilling permits that went into committee in 1988 and never came back out. She thought about the particular timing of a mine closure that happened 6 months after Robert Hargrove had come to work one Monday morning carrying something heavy that he hadn't decided what to do with yet. Then she thought about the mine shaft itself. The historical diagrams in the library archive showed the upper level of the Hargrove Mine as a passage approximately 8 feet wide, 7 feet high, timbered at regular intervals with old-growth wood, with a planked floor and rail tracks running the main passage. The upper level sat at an average depth of 40 to 50 feet below the surface. At that depth, geothermal gradient held the air temperature in the low 40s year-round. No wind, no precipitation, no variation between a night when the surface was -11 and a night when it was 60 above. Nora was not thinking about mineral rights or silver prices or what the land might be worth. She was thinking about November through March and the specific quality of a Montana winter when you have no place that is actually yours. November 3rd was a Saturday. She borrowed use of Walt Gruber's truck for the day in exchange for a week of fence repair on the rural property north of town that Walt had been promising to address for 2 years. She drove the 45 miles to fielding on roads that already had November in them, gray and stripped, the fields on either side bare, and the sky low. She arrived at the county clerk's office at 9:45, 15 minutes early. The clerk's office was a low municipal building with institutional carpeting and a smell that seemed specific to county government everywhere, old paper and stale coffee, and a kind of permanent indoor overcast. Folding chairs had been set in rows facing a small podium. About 20 people had gathered. Most of them had the look of people who attend county auctions professionally or out of practice curiosity. Nora took a seat near the back row. She recognized 2 faces from Copperhead almost immediately. Dale Stonebridge was standing against the back wall with his arms crossed. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, dressed in the expensive casual manner of men who have never needed clothing to announce them, because the room does it already. His father Marcus had died 3 years ago, leaving Dale a development company, a commercial real estate portfolio in 3 counties, and a family name that still moved things at the county level in ways that were difficult to trace, but not difficult to observe if you were paying attention. Dale was not, strictly speaking, someone Nora could point to as having done anything specifically wrong. He was the kind of man who watched the world arrange itself to his advantage and had long since stopped finding that remarkable. He glanced at her when she sat down. His expression moved through something brief that she read as amusement, and then he looked away. Howard Sims, the county clerk, called the room to order at 10 exactly and moved through the first 6 properties on the auction list in under 25 minutes. 3 sold for small amounts to the professionals in the front rows. 3 received no bids and were passed. Then Howard read the Hargrove listing. Parcel 14A, Hargrove Mining Claim. Hargrove Mountain, 280 acres inclusive of mineral rights and all surface and subsurface structures, as currently standing. Tax arrears of $29,400 to be assumed by the winning bidder within 60 days of sale. Starting bid of $1. He looked out at the room. Do I have $1? Nora raised her hand. The shift in the room was immediate. Someone in the front row turned to look at her. Two women she knew from Patty's, sitting 3 chairs to her left, exchanged something in voices that were quiet but not silent. Howard noted the bid without expression. Do I have $5? Nothing. Then Dale pushed off the back wall with his weight and said, casually, 20. Nora said, 40. Dale looked at her again with slightly more attention than before. He had the expression of a man working through a small puzzle that he does not expect to remain puzzling for long. 100. 150. The sound behind her shifted in the way that sounds shift when an audience has decided what it is watching. Two people talking at a volume meant for each other but calibrated, perhaps deliberately, to carry a few feet further than that. 200, Dale said. 260, Nora said. That was the number. She had $260 in a plain envelope in her jacket pocket. She had counted it twice that morning. She could not bid further than 260. She was at the end. The room waited. Dale looked at her steadily, his expression holding something she could not fully identify. Not fury. Something quieter and less certain than fury. He straightened slightly and let the pause run. 300, he said. She heard that clearly. 300 was $40 past what she had, and she did not have $40 available. She could not bid, but she was watching him the way she watched everything she could not afford to misread, and what she saw was not a man who wanted this property. What she saw was a man performing the conclusion of something he had already decided, placing a bid that was $40 above hers with the posture of someone who considered the matter now resolved and was ready to move on to the next item on the day's agenda. He was not bidding to acquire 280 acres of a closed mine. He was bidding to remind the room, and possibly to remind her specifically, about the order in which things worked. She had been the subject of that reminder in various forms for her entire life. It produced in her chest a specific heat that was not anger exactly, or not only anger. She said, 320. The room went quiet differently than it had been quiet before. Dale turned back slowly. The expression he had been wearing since she raised her hand was gone. What replaced it was something she recognized from the faces of people who encounter a refusal they had not accounted for. He looked at her for a long moment that had no amusement in it anywhere. He did not bid. Howard looked between them and let the silence hold. Going once. A pause. Going twice. The gavel came down with a crack. Sold. 280 acres and full mineral rights, Hargrove Mountain, to the young woman in the back row, for $320. A few people near the front applauded reflexively, the way auction rooms respond to any concluded transaction. Most of the room was quiet. The two women from Patty's were looking at her with identical expressions containing pity and something harder than pity, the specific disapproval of people watching someone make what they consider a predictable mistake. She signed the transfer documents at the clerk's desk with hands that were steadier than she expected. She handed over the envelope. In return, she received a packet of papers with the county seal on them and a key ring with 2 keys on it, both dark with age, their metal surfaces cool and slightly rough in her palm. She looked at them for a moment at the desk. The first key was large and heavy, clearly a gate or access key for one of the mine's surface structures. The second was smaller. Its tooth pattern looked like an interior door lock, not a padlock or a gate, but a building lock, a keyed entry cylinder. She did not know what it was for. She filed it away and put the ring in her jacket pocket. Howard reminded her in a businesslike tone that the tax notice would arrive by mail within 30 days and payment was due within 60 days of the auction date. He said it without particular emphasis, the way people say things they have said many times to people who mostly already know them. She walked out to the borrowed truck and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes before starting the engine. Through the windshield, she could see Dale Stonebridge on the clerk's office steps, talking to a heavy-set man in a canvas jacket she did not recognize. Dale's posture was easy. He had the look of someone who had made a small concession in a transaction that was not over yet and was not troubled by it. She started the truck and drove back toward Copperhead. The gravel track to the Hargrove Mine property left the state highway 3 miles north of town and climbed a mile upward through scrub pine and open rock, the track so long ungraded that in places it had reverted to bare bedrock with gravel at the edges. The borrowed truck managed it. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. When the track crested the final rise, she stopped and got out. The Hargrove Mine was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was a scar on the face of a mountain, the visual record of an industrial operation that had extracted and left, and it looked exactly like what it was. The head frame still stood, maybe 60 feet of rusted timber and iron rising against the afternoon sky with the functional authority of things built to serve rather than to please. Below it the ground was tailings, crushed gray rock mixed with 35 years of returning scrub and dried grass. The main surface building had partially collapsed inward, the roof sunken, 3 walls standing, the 4th down and half buried under tailings drift. A smaller storage shed nearby had taken some kind of impact at some point and had a wall bowed outward at a degree that suggested it was thinking seriously about the ground. She walked the surface of the property slowly, in the direction the late sun was coming from, no particular hurry. The wind was quieter here on the sheltered slope than in the valley below. She could hear it moving through the pines above the head frame, but at the shaft level it was still and cold and smelled of pine resin and something mineral that she could not name, but that she associated, without knowing why, with depth. She stopped at the base of the head frame and looked at the main shaft entrance. Someone had poured concrete into the original timber frame at some point after the closure, filling the opening solid. The pour was smooth and uniform, deliberate work with proper equipment, not the patchy, improvised seal of an emergency. 20 feet along the base of the head frame structure, partly hidden behind a drift of tailings that had built up against the head frame's base over decades, she found a ventilation shaft cover set in a concrete collar in the ground. Approximately 3 feet across, steel lid, for lag bolts around the collar. She stood over it for a moment. Then she went back to the truck and got her socket set. The bolts were seized with rust, but none of them were stripped, and she worked through them with a breaker bar and patience, her hands going numb twice in the cold before she stopped and warmed them inside her jacket and went back to it. The last bolt cleared the collar and the lid was heavy, close to 60 pounds, and she walked it aside on its edge and set it down in the gravel. The opening below was circular and dark and smelled of earth and stone and something that had no surface equivalent, the particular quality of air that has been underground long enough to become its own atmosphere. She could feel it on her face, cool and steady, the breath of deep rock. She tied the rope ladder to the base of the head frame, lowered it through the opening, and climbed down. The upper level of the Hargrove Mine was not what she had pictured. She had pictured something low and cramped, the kind of space shown in old mining photographs where men are bent double with lamps on their helmets. What she found was a passage 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, cut through solid gray rock with the efficiency of an operation that had never been small. Timber supports ran at regular intervals. Old growth would gone dark with decades of mine air. The floor had been planked and the boards had warped and swollen with moisture over the years, but were mostly intact underfoot. Rail tracks ran down the center of the passage, the car long gone, but the tracks themselves still fixed solidly in the planking. The temperature hit her face immediately, steadier and warmer than the surface, the mine holding its deep ground baseline the way it had held it for however long the rock had been there. She walked the main passage for the first hour, getting her bearings, comparing what she saw against the archive diagram she had printed and folded into her jacket. The upper level ran approximately 300 feet before branching into a north passage and a continuation to the south. She went north first. The north branch dead-ended after about 80 feet at a section of backfill. Loose rock and concrete poured together to seal that portion of the mine, indistinguishable from natural collapse unless you looked carefully at the regularity of the material. Distribution. She looked carefully. She filed it away. The south passage continued another 180 feet past the junction before reaching the main shaft blockage, the concrete pour she had seen from outside. She walked to the end and laid her hand on it. Solid. Old. Poured from the outside inward by someone with equipment that had to be brought to the site, not something anyone improvised. On one of the timber supports about 30 feet from the junction, she found a brass plate nailed into the wood, stamped with a date and a section designation. The date was 1971. The section number matched the diagram. Someone had logged and numbered the entire upper level systematically. That kind of attention meant the Hargroves had been serious operators, not a marginal family claim, but a real mine run by people who understood what they had. She came back the next day with everything she owned. The sleeping bag and the plywood sheet she had taken from behind Patty's. Her pack with the camp stove, 2 gallons of water, and the food supply she had left. She lowered all of it through the ventilation shaft on a rope and then climbed down herself. She made her living space in a widened section of the main passage 60 feet from the shaft entrance, where someone had clearly done the same thing before her. A break area. The passage was wider here, a few feet in each direction, with a flat ledge cut into the west wall at roughly sitting height. The ledge was the right height for either sitting on or using as a surface. She laid the plywood flat on the ground, spread the sleeping bag, and arranged her pack and food on the ledge. She hung the lantern from a peg in one of the timber supports and lit it. She had a small propane camp stove. She could heat water and make instant coffee and soup. She had the water filter for the creek she had found a short hike from the mine entrance. She had the protein bars and the instant coffee and the knowledge that she was 50 feet underground in November with $20 and 60 days to figure out the next step. She slept better that first night than she had in months. No wind. No variation. The mine settled around her with small sounds that were not threatening, the natural sounds of old timber and deep rock doing what they had always done, and she fell asleep listening to them, and woke to the lantern still burning and the temperature unchanged. On the morning of her second full day underground, she did a thorough survey, running the lantern slowly along the walls instead of just navigating by the center of the passage. She was looking at timber condition, checking for water seepage, mapping the structural details in her notebook in the plain language she used for home repair inventory. Wet or dry, stable or moving, sealed or open, recent or old. She had been trained to look at things this way by years of working in other people's houses where the difference between what was visible and what was actually happening behind the walls was often the only variable that mattered. She was walking the south passage back toward the main junction, her lantern held up and moving slowly across the west wall, when she reached a section about 180 feet from the junction and stopped. The wall here was different. Not stone, not the original gray rock that comprised the rest of the tunnel, and not the timber and planking system either. A section of the west wall, roughly 12 feet wide, was faced in concrete block, gray and regular, laid in careful courses with mortar lines that were clean and consistent, the work of someone who knew what they were doing. She ran her hand across the surface and looked at the mortar joints and at the way moisture had worked into the face of the concrete over time. She had spent enough hours looking at old concrete in old buildings to know how it ages, how the oxidation and the moisture absorption work into the surface in a gradual accumulation that is specific to exposure and time. The blocks on this wall had not been here since 1989. They were not old enough for that. The surface weathering pattern said mid to late 1980s at the latest, and in the interior of an active mine the aging process accelerated, which pushed the date earlier rather than later. She estimated 1987 or 1988, before the mine closed, while the mine was still running. Someone had built this wall while the Hargrove Mine was still an operating operation. She held the lantern at different angles, moving it left and right and higher and lower, looking at the face of the concrete from different directions. The mortar was consistent. The blocks were consistent. There was no visible damage to the facing except for a thin film of surface moisture and the faint mineral staining you would expect. In the center of the concrete section, almost exactly its center, painted the same gray as the surrounding blocks with enough precision that she had passed this spot twice in previous surveys without registering it, was a steel door. Not a mine door. Not industrial steel with a hasp and a padlock the way utility doors in a working mine were fitted. A proper interior door in a proper steel frame, with hinges that had been greased at some point. She could see the slight residue of lubricant at the hinge barrel, and a lock cylinder that was not a padlock at all, but a keyed entry lock, the kind you would fit in a building that mattered, and that was meant to remain accessible to specific people and inaccessible to everyone else. The door had been painted to match the surrounding concrete. The frame had been mortared into the block with care. Someone had not wanted this door found by anyone who was not looking very specifically for it. She stood in front of it for a long time with the lantern held up, looking at the frame and at the condition of the steel and at the concrete around the edges of the frame where the mortar met the block. Everything she could see said this had been built carefully and with intention by someone who understood what they were protecting and what they were protecting it from. She thought about what Gus Dalton had told her about the summer of 1988 and the look on Robert Hargrove's face on a Monday morning when he arrived at the mine, carrying something he had not decided what to do with yet. She thought about the drilling permit applications that went into county committee review and never came back out. She thought about Marcus Stonebridge on the county mining authority and about his son Dale standing in the back of the auction room that morning with his arms crossed, and about the expression on Dale's face when she said 320. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and found the key ring the county clerk had handed her after she signed the transfer documents. 2 keys. The large one for the surface access. The smaller one, the one whose tooth pattern looked like an interior door lock, the one she had not yet found a matching cylinder for anywhere on the property. She took it out and looked at it in the lantern light. The teeth were still sharp. The metal was dark with age, but the cut was clean. She had walked past this door twice without seeing it. She had been down here 3 days. She had a key she had not yet tried and a lock she had not yet found. And she was standing 6 feet from a steel door in the wall of a closed mine. A door that had been built before the mine was shut down and painted to be invisible, in the wall of a passage that according to the official county record was supposed to contain nothing more consequential than old timber supports and decades of empty air. She thought about all of it for a long time. Then she put the key in her pocket and walked back to her sleeping area and sat with her camp stove and her instant coffee and the particular quality of underground quiet that had no surface equivalent. She had been down here 3 days. She had been careful, and she had been deliberate, and she had not rushed toward anything before she understood it. Tomorrow she was going to try the key. She had slept badly on the 4th night. Not because of the cold, which had stayed at steady 43 degrees and no longer surprised her, but because the key was in her jacket pocket and the jacket was folded under her head, and every time she shifted she felt the weight of it against her ear. Small as it was, old as it was, she had turned it over in her mind the same way she had turned it over in her fingers before she went to sleep, looking at it from every angle she could reach, and she had still not tried it in the lock. She tried it the morning of the 4th day. The south passage was dark past the reach of the lantern until the light caught up with her, and she walked it slowly the way she had walked it a dozen times over the past 3 days, her hand along the west wall to keep her bearing in the narrow corridor of light. The backfill at the dead end of the north branch was behind her, the junction behind that, the ventilation shaft and the rope ladder and the surface and everything outside the mine behind all of it. Down here there was only the passage and the rock and the sound of her own footsteps on the old planking. The concrete block wall appeared at the edge of the lantern's reach, gray and regular, the door in its center almost invisible against the matching paint. She set the lantern on the floor so the light came up at the door from below and held the key ring out and took the smaller key between 2 fingers. She looked at it one more time. The tooth pattern was consistent with an interior lock cylinder, the kind of key a locksmith would cut for a building door, not the rough, heavy iron of a mine access key. The metal was dark with age, but the profile of the cut was clean. She put it in the cylinder. It seated with the specific resistance of a mechanism that has not moved in a long time, but is still functional, still precisely what it was made to be. The fit was exact. She stood still for a moment with the key seated in the lock, her hand on the bow of it, not turning it yet, just feeling the fit. She had been a practical person out of necessity her entire life. She did not believe in signs or fate or the particular kind of story where things align because they were always meant to. She believed in cause and effect. She believed in the chain of decisions and accidents and choices that had placed her in this specific passage on this specific morning with this specific key in her hand. She could trace every link in that chain back to a cracked radiator on a highway in spring and a yellow notice on a bulletin board and an old man who came to a hardware store every Thursday afternoon and told her things she had not known she needed to know. None of that was fate. All of it was real. She turned the key. The cylinder rotated. She could feel the bolt withdrawing inside the door frame, a slight tremor through the key, through her fingers, into her palm. She pulled her hand back and pushed the door. The hinges resisted. Not seized, not rusted through, just stiff from years of disuse and the weight of the door itself, which was solid steel and heavier than it looked. She pushed harder and the door moved, slowly at first, and then faster as the hinges found their range. And then it was open and the air from inside reached her face. It was drier than the mine passage. That was the first thing she noticed. The passage air had a mineral dampness in it, the low-grade moisture that comes from rock at depth. But the air coming through the door was different, almost arid, as though whatever sealed the room had kept the outside air out as effectively as it had kept the contents in. She picked up the lantern and stepped through. The room was small, 10 or 12 feet on each side, with a low ceiling that was raw rock rather than the finished surface of the passage. Metal shelving ran along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, the kind of industrial shelving used in archives and commercial storage, the crossbars. Bolted and braced, and still solidly upright. The 4th wall was the door she had just come through. In the center of the room was a metal desk, painted gray, the surface clear except for one object sitting exactly in the middle of it. A metal strongbox, gray painted, approximately the size of a large dictionary, with a combination dial on the front. She stood in the doorway for a moment, holding the lantern up, and looked at all of it. The shelving was full. Every shelf held document boxes, stacked and labeled in a hand she did not yet know, block letters in black marker on white tape. The labels were organized by year and category. She could read them from where she stood. Mineral surveys, correspondence, legal, financial, each year tracked from 1941 to 1989. The boxes for the last few years, 1986, 1987, 1988, were thicker than the earlier ones, packed in more densely, the contents pressing against the cardboard sides. She set the lantern on the desk and moved to the nearest shelf, pulling the box labeled Mineral Surveys 1988 first. Inside were technical documents, geological survey reports, the kind of paperwork that mining operations generate in quantity and that most people would not know how to read. She had not known how to read them either, before the past week at the library and 2 evenings going through the State Mining Registry's technical glossary. She had taught herself enough of the vocabulary to follow the substance. She read standing at the shelf. The 1988 surveys detailed drilling samples from multiple depths in the south section of the mine, the section that led toward the sealed room, the section below the upper level where the main or bodies had been. The early samples, from the first and second quarters of 1988, were in the established range for the mine's silver and copper seams. Then in August the samples changed. The drill had gone deeper than the existing workings. The language of the report was technical and careful in the way scientific documents are careful, precise in what it claimed and specific about uncertainty margins, but even reading across a knowledge gap, she could follow the central finding. At depth, below the known or bodies, the drill had struck a formation the surveyor described as a contact metasomatic deposit with elevated concentrations of platinum group metals. Palladium, rhodium, smaller quantities of platinum. The surveyor's language grew more careful as the report continued, which she had learned was the technical writer's way of signaling that the numbers were too large to state casually. She flipped to the summary page. The estimated recoverable deposit, based on core samples from 12 drill sites in the affected zone, was listed as approximately 90,000 troy ounces of palladium, 14,000 troy ounces of rhodium, and an additional quantity of platinum the surveyor listed as requiring further drilling to fully characterize. Below that, In the surveyor's own handwriting in the margin was a note that looked as if it had been added after the fact, a calculation performed quickly, almost impulsively. He had written current market value followed by a number and then, after a gap, a second number with a question mark beside it. The first number was the 1988 value. She did not recognize the exact market prices from that year, but the figure was large. The second number, the one with the question mark, had a date written beside it, 1995. A speculative projection. The surveyor had been trying to estimate what the deposit would be worth at a future market price that he could not know. He had been wrong about the direction of the market. He had projected modestly. The actual market, she knew from what she had read at the library in the past week, had gone far beyond modest. Palladium had been worth less than $200 an ounce in the late 1980s. By the early 2020s, it had crossed $2,000 an ounce. Rhodium had moved even more dramatically. She stood at the shelf for a long time, looking at the survey report, doing arithmetic in her head that kept producing numbers too large for her to fully process. She set the 1988 survey down and opened the box labeled Mineral Surveys 1987. The earlier samples, she confirmed, were in the silver and copper range the mine had always produced. Nothing unusual. Nothing to explain the locked room or the sealed wall or the envelope addressed to a woman who had left the valley on a Tuesday morning and not come back. Then August 1988, and the drill went deep and everything changed. She thought about what that discovery had meant to Robert Hargrove. He had run this mine for 14 years by 1988. He had been born into the mining business, had grown up walking these passages, had spent his adult life managing the extraction and the workers and the county relationships and the market fluctuations that were part of any mineral operation. He had known the mine the way a farmer knows a particular field, its limits and its character and its reliable yields. And then one August morning the drill broke through into something that was an order of magnitude beyond anything the mine had ever produced, and he had sat in his office with the door closed and his hands on the desk, and not moved. She understood that response now. She was having a version of it herself, standing in a sealed underground room with a survey report in her hands. She set it down and went to the strongbox on the desk. The combination dial was a standard 3-position lock. She tried the obvious sequences first, the ones anyone with knowledge of the mine's history might try. The mine's founding year, 1941. She felt the tumblers move, and then a line, and the lid released, and she opened it. Inside was a leather journal, worn at the corners, the cover darkened where hands had held it repeatedly. Beside it were 3 sealed envelopes, 2 of them addressed to lawyers whose names she did not recognize, one addressed to Charlotte. Not Charlotte Hargrove, just Charlotte. She left the envelopes where they were and opened the journal. The handwriting was the same block lettering she had seen on the document box labels, deliberate and clear, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write for permanence rather than speed. The first entry was dated June 14, 1988. She read, Robert Hargrove had been keeping this journal since the summer of 1988, which was the summer the drill broke through into the formation at depth and changed what the mine was. He wrote about the discovery with the restrained precision of a man who had been in the mining business his entire adult life and understood what a find like this meant. Understood it in the way you understand something that is simultaneously a windfall and a target. He had not told anyone right away. He had sent the core samples to the geological surveyor under a false job order, a routine survey, nothing specific, and waited for the report. When the report came back, he wrote about sitting in his office above the mine for a long time with the door closed and his hands on his desk, not moving. Then he had begun to plan. He wrote about filing the drilling permits with the County Mining Authority in September of 1988, the bureaucratic step required before he could legally proceed to extraction. He wrote it as a necessary formality, routine procedure. He had filed permits before. He understood the process. What he had not fully understood, he wrote in a later entry, was how thoroughly Marcus Stonebridge had embedded himself in the county's mining permitting process over the previous 15 years. He had known Stonebridge was present on the authority board. He had not known the degree to which Stonebridge had positioned himself as the essential node through which mining permit decisions in Harlan County had to pass, not officially, not on any document, but in practice, functionally, in the way that certain people in small government bodies become the actual decision regardless of what the formal process specifies. Stonebridge had approached him in October of 1988. Robert described the meeting in detail that suggested he had replayed it many times afterward. Stonebridge had been pleasant. He had been indirect. He had talked about the county's interest in responsible mineral development and about the importance of community partnerships in large-scale operations and about the particular challenges of bringing a deep-level platinum extraction project to market without the kind of capital and connections that most small family operations did not have access to. What he was saying, underneath all of that, was that the permits would not move without Stonebridge's support, and that Stonebridge's support had a price. He wanted 40% of the mine. Robert had refused. He wrote about the refusal briefly and without elaboration, just the fact of it and the date and the particular quiet that followed in Stonebridge's expression when he said no. The next entries documented the next 6 months in detail that became more compressed and more urgent as the situation escalated. The permits stalled in committee. A county inspector arrived at the mine unannounced and filed a report noting structural concerns that Robert wrote were fabricated in every specific. A second inspector came and noted additional concerns. The legal challenges Robert filed went to a county magistrate who Robert noted was present at a fundraising dinner for the county commissioner that Stonebridge had hosted the previous spring. He had sent Charlotte away in November of 1987, 3 months before the permits stalled and 14 months before the mine was closed. He wrote about this decision in a long entry that was different in tone from the rest of the journal, slower and more careful, the handwriting more deliberate in the places where the difficulty of what he was describing came through. Charlotte had been at the mine every summer since she was a child. She knew the property the way she knew the lines on her own hands. When Robert began to understand that Stonebridge was not going to be satisfied with a refusal, that the situation was going to escalate beyond what a legal challenge could contain in the short term, he had made the decision that Charlotte could not be here when it did. He had given her money. He had told her to go far away and build a life and stay out of the story that was coming, because the story that was coming was not one he could protect her from while she was standing inside it. Charlotte had not wanted to go. Robert wrote that she had argued with him for 3 days. She had told him she was not going to leave him alone with this. He had told her that if she stayed, she would become a lever Stonebridge could use against him, and that knowing she was gone and safe was the only way he could fight without flinching. She went on a Tuesday morning in November of 1987. She drove out of the valley in a car that Robert had bought in his own name, so it could not be traced back to her, and she did not look back at the mine on the way down the mountain. Robert wrote about watching her car disappear around the bend at the bottom of the road. He wrote one sentence about it. She did not write after that. I don't know where she went. I need to not know, for both our sakes. I hope she is building something good somewhere far from here. Nora read that sentence twice. She kept reading. The final months of the journal, running from January 1989 through March of that year, documented the end of the mine with a precision that she understood was deliberate. Robert was creating a record. He knew it might be the only one. He described the sequence of county actions, the inspector reports and the permit denials, and the legal maneuvering that eventually produced an official finding of structural instability in the main shaft entrance. He described the morning in March when county officials arrived with equipment to seal the main entrance, which they had the legal authority to do under the safety code citations that had been accumulating. He had been in this room when they sealed the entrance. He had built the room in 1988, after the first meeting with Stonebridge, after he understood what the situation was going to become. He had built it with his own hands over 2 weekends, working alone, bringing the concrete blocks down through the ventilation shaft one at a time in a pack frame, mixing the mortar in small batches so there was nothing left over to explain. He had moved every document of consequence, every survey, every financial record, every piece of evidence he had accumulated about Stonebridge's actions into this room. He had sealed it and painted the door. He had put the key on a ring with the mine's access key and lodged it with the county clerk's office under the property deed, which was standard practice for archived property keys in the county's record system. If the mine was ever sold, whoever bought it would receive the keys as part of the transfer. He had not told anyone this. He had hoped he would live long enough to use the evidence himself. He had filed his challenges and lost them and filed them again, and by 1993, he had known that he was not going to win through the court channels available to him. He died that October. The challenges lapsed. The mine stayed sealed and abandoned, and no one came. The last pages of the journal were not entries. They were a letter, dated March of 1989, written in the same block hand. To whoever finds this room. I am writing this because I do not expect to be the one who uses what I have put in here. I have made enemies I cannot defeat through honest means with the tools available to me in this county, and I am not willing to do what winning through other means would require. What I can do is leave the evidence for someone who comes after me, someone who is not compromised and not afraid, and not already inside the machinery that Stonebridge has built. What you have found in this room is the following. The full geological surveys for the platinum group metal deposit at depth in the south section of the Hargrove Mine, prepared by an independent surveyor under a neutral job order in 1988. The deposit is real and it is large. Anyone with access to a current commodities market can calculate what it is worth. I am told it is the largest PGM deposit ever found in the state of Montana by a significant margin. You will also find the full financial records of the Hargrove family estate, including deeds for 4 properties outside the mine claim, $218,000 in bearer bonds issued through First Territorial Bank of Billings in 1986 and 1987, and stock certificates for 17 companies in which the family held positions at the time of my writing this. I do not know what those certificates are worth now. I know what they were worth when I put them in the room, and I know what the companies were. You will find documentation of Marcus Stonebridge's actions from October 1988 through March 1989, including the original permit applications and the subsequent county responses, the inspector reports with specific annotations about the fabrications they contain, correspondence between Stonebridge and 2 county officials that I obtained through sources I am not going to name here, because naming them could harm people I have no desire to harm, and bank records showing transfers between accounts that I was able to trace. You will find one envelope addressed to my daughter Charlotte. I did not send it because I did not know where to send it. If you are a stranger who has found this room by ordinary means, please try to find her and give it to her. If she is gone and you know her child, give it to the child. The mine and everything in it belongs to Charlotte or to her child if Charlotte is gone. That is my intent, and that is the legal instruction in the documents in the financial box, 3rd shelf from the right, bottom row. I had those documents prepared by a lawyer outside the county who has never heard of Marcus Stonebridge and has no reason to do anything but what I paid him to do. Use what is in this room carefully and well. Stonebridge is dangerous when cornered. I know this better than most. The mine is worth fighting for. So is the truth. Robert Hargrove Mountain, Montana, March 14, 1989. Nora set the journal down on the metal desk. The lantern flame moved in the dry, sealed air of the room. She could hear nothing except the sound of her own breathing and the faint, impossibly distant sound of the mountain existing around her. She sat with Robert Hargrove's letter for a long time. Then she did something she had not done since the night she aged out of foster care and sat in the neon outside the house on Darlene Street waiting for the specific feeling of finality to pass. She put her hands over her face and held very still. When she took her hands away, she reached into her jacket pocket and found her wallet and opened it to the photograph. Her mother standing on rocky terrain, laughing at a camera, dark hair loose around her shoulders. The sky behind her, that specific deep Montana blue. In the background, slightly out of focus, the industrial structure she had never been able to identify. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she set it down on the desk beside the journal and walked back through the door into the mine passage and followed the south passage to its end, to the concrete pour sealing the main entrance, and then back to the main junction, and then along the main passage to the ventilation shaft and up the ladder into the morning air. The head frame rose above her, 60 feet of rusted timber and iron. She walked around to the north face of it, facing the mountain, and stood where she estimated the camera must have been positioned when the photograph was taken. She looked back at the head frame. The angle was right. The height was right. The shape of the timber cross bracing visible in the background of the photograph matched exactly what was in front of her now. The photograph had been taken from this spot. Her mother had been standing here, on this ground, on this mountain, in front of this head frame, laughing at whoever held the camera. Charlotte Vance. Charlotte Hargrove. Robert's daughter. The woman who had driven out of this valley on a Tuesday morning in November of 1987 and not looked back. The envelope in the strongbox was addressed to Charlotte. Nora stood at the base of the head frame in the November cold for a long time, looking at the structure in front of her, And then she looked down at the photograph in her hand. And then she looked back up at the headframe. And she understood with a completeness that left no room for doubt who she was and where she had come from and why she was here. Back in the sealed room, she went through the remaining documents. The financial box, third shelf from the right, bottom row, held what Robert had described. The estate documents from the outside lawyer established Charlotte or her lawful heir as the sole beneficiary of the Hargrove estate, with the mine claim and all associated mineral rights explicitly included. The documents were notarized and filed with a legal firm in Billings under a case number that would be traceable if you knew to look. They were 35 years old, and they were still in force. The bearer bonds were there, $218,000 face value, issued in 1986 and 1987, still legally valid and payable to whoever held them. The stock certificates were there, 17 companies, the shares accumulated by the Hargrove family over decades of profitable operation. She did not know what those companies were worth now or whether all of them still existed, but several of the names she recognized as major corporations that had not only survived but grown significantly since the mid-1980s. The property deeds covered 4 parcels outside the mine claim itself, 3 residential lots in Copperhead that the Hargroves had owned and that appeared, based on the county records she had read at the library, to have never been formally transferred to another owner, and a commercial property in Fielding that was currently occupied by a business she did not recognize. The properties had been generating no tax revenue and no formal claim, sitting in the same legal limbo as the mine for 3 decades. She found the box labeled Stonebridge Evidence and opened it. Robert had not understated what he had accumulated. The box held the original permit applications with their filing stamps and the subsequent committee responses, organized chronologically. It held the inspector reports with Robert's handwritten annotations on each page, noting specific fabrications and cross-referencing them against actual conditions documented in his own maintenance records. It held a folder of correspondence that was the most damning material in the box, letters and memoranda between Stonebridge and a county official named Earl Purvis, written with enough indirection to maintain plausible deniability, but direct enough that the meaning was clear to any reader paying attention. It held bank records, account statements for a personal account held by Marcus Stonebridge at a regional bank, showing deposits in the months following each permit denial and each inspector visit, the amounts consistent enough in size and timing to establish a pattern that no reasonable person could look at and see as coincidental. Marcus Stonebridge was dead, but Dale Stonebridge had inherited everything his father left, including the development company that now controlled, through a series of county arrangements Nora had not had time to fully trace, the lease rights to the Hargrove Mountain mineral claims that Marcus had arranged for after Robert Hargrove died, and the mine fell into administrative limbo. She did not fully understand the legal architecture of what Stonebridge Sr. had built, but she understood enough. Dale was collecting revenue from her mine, had been collecting it for years. Whatever the lease arrangement said, it was built on the foundation of what his father had stolen, and what his father had stolen was now demonstrably hers. She was sitting on the floor of the sealed room with the financial documents spread around her when she noticed the last item on the bottom shelf of the financial box. A manila envelope, sealed with tape, with a date written on the outside in a hand different from Robert's. The date was 2019. She opened it. Inside was a 3-page document on the letterhead of a geological consulting firm based in Missoula. The document was a mineral deposit assessment, current as of 2019, based on the 1988 survey data updated with current market pricing for platinum group metals. The language was formal and precise. The conclusion was on the last page. Estimated current market value of recoverable platinum group metal deposit, Hargrove Mountain South Section, applying 2019 average market prices for palladium, rhodium, and platinum, $480 million. Lower bound estimate. She read it twice. Then she looked at the bottom of the last page. There was no firm signature on the document. There were 2 initials, written in pencil in the lower right corner. GD. She sat with that for a while. She knew those initials. She had been sitting with the documents spread around her, the lantern burning lower than she liked, when she heard it. Faint at first, the sound traveling down through 48 feet of rock and timber. A vehicle engine coming up the mine road. The sound particular to a heavy vehicle on rough gravel, a pickup, or an SUV. She turned the lantern off. In the total darkness of the sealed room, she sat still and listened. The engine stopped. Doors. 2 sets of footsteps on the surface. She could hear them as a distant percussion through the stone, not clearly but enough to count. They moved around on the surface for a while. She heard the sound of the ventilation shaft collar, the metallic resonance of someone moving the hatch cover she had left off its collar and leaning against the headframe base. Voices, too far away and too muffled by the rock to make out words. She moved in the dark, by memory and by touch, from the sealed room into the mine passage, pulling the steel door shut behind her as quietly as she could manage. It seated with a faint click that sounded enormous to her in the silence. She kept one hand on the west wall and walked the south passage back toward the main junction, then turned north and moved quickly along the main passage toward the north branch. The north branch dead-ended at the backfill 80 feet in. She went to the end of it and put her back against the filled section and sat down on the plank floor and made herself small and still. She heard them come down the shaft. 2 sets of boots on the ladder rungs, the sound carrying clearly through the passage now that they were underground. Flashlight beams appeared in the main passage, moving south. 2 men. She could see their silhouettes against the light they were carrying, dark shapes against a slightly less dark background. One was tall and broad through the shoulders. Dale Stonebridge, and someone she did not recognize. They walked the main passage without stopping at the north branch entrance, moving south. She heard their footsteps slow as they went deeper, heard them reach the south branch and turn into it. Their voices were audible now. Not the words yet, but the rhythm and tone, Dale's voice and a shorter, quicker voice she did not know. They walked the south passage. They reached the concrete block wall. She heard Dale's voice go quiet. The other man said something. Dale said something back, his voice lower and more controlled than it had been, the kind of voice people use when they are managing something internally while speaking outwardly. There was a pause. She heard someone try the door handle. It was locked. She had turned the key when she left. More conversation. She still could not make out the words. Dale's voice again, then the other man's, shorter and faster. She could hear the quality of the exchange now, the specific compressed urgency of 2 people who have found something in a state they did not expect. They stayed at the door for what felt like a long time. Then the footsteps came back up the south passage. The flashlight beams reappeared in the main passage, moving north now, toward the shaft entrance and toward the north branch where she was sitting with her back against 35 years of packed-in rock and her hands flat on the plank floor. She pressed herself against the backfill. The beams reached the north branch entrance. One of them swept inside, moving left to right across the dead-end passage, the light traveling across the walls and the backfill and the floor. It passed over her. The beam was pointed at the wall, and she was on the floor below it, and she was wearing dark clothing, and she was not moving. The light stayed for a moment. Then it moved on. She heard them climb the shaft, boots on the rungs, and then the surface sounds muffled through rock, and then the vehicle engine starting, and then the sound of tires on gravel going back down the mine road, and then nothing. She sat in the dark for a long time before she moved. What Nora is about to learn from the man who has been carrying this secret for 30 years is going to lay bare not just the full scope of what was stolen and what was hidden, but who Nora Vance actually is, and why this mine and this mountain were always going to end up hers. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you are enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. She climbed out of the shaft into cold late afternoon air. The sun was already behind the ridge to the west, and the valley below was in shadow. She could see where Dale's vehicle had parked from the tire tracks in the dried-out weeds near the headframe. 2 sets of boot prints in the cold mud at the edges of the gravel. They knew she had been in the room. The 2019 document meant someone had been in the room before her, and that someone was almost certainly Gus Dalton, and if Gus had accessed the room, he had either told someone or someone had found out. And if Dale knew the room existed and had come looking for it, then the clock on what Nora could do quietly and without interference had already run out. She drove the borrowed truck down the mine road and onto the state highway and turned south toward Copperhead. The town appeared in her headlights 20 minutes later, the copper tap sign visible from the edge of town, a few lit windows on the residential streets, the hardware store dark. She drove to the east side of town, where the older houses sat back from the road under the tall cottonwoods that had been growing there since before the mine opened. Gus Dalton's house was a small two-story frame house with a covered porch and a woodpile stacked under the eave of the carport that ran the full length of the east wall. The lights in the kitchen were on. She knocked. He answered the door on the second knock. The way people answer doors in small towns where unexpected visitors do not typically mean danger. He was wearing a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he had a mug in his hand. He looked at her face for a moment, and then he stepped aside without saying anything and held the door open. She went in. His kitchen was warm and crowded in the way of a person who had lived alone in the same house for a long time and had gradually filled the available space with books and papers and the accumulated objects of a life that did not involve throwing much away. The table held a coffee mug and a topographic map of Harlan County, partially unfolded, its center section oriented to Hargrove Mountain. She sat down at the table without being asked because her legs had decided they were done holding her upright. He poured a second mug of coffee and set it in front of her and sat down across from her. He looked at her without expression, the calm, waiting look of someone who has been expecting a particular conversation for a long time and has had time to prepare himself for it. She said, "The initials on the 2019 assessment." He said, "I wondered if you'd find that." She said, "You were in the sealed room." He said, "Once. For years ago in March. I got the key from the county property archives, where it's been sitting since Robert lodged it in 1989. He had me get it out of the building while I was still working there, years ago, and I put it back again when I was done." She looked at him. "He told me about the room 2 months before he died," he said. "He told me what was in it, and he told me where the key was. And he asked me to leave it alone until the property sold to someone who had a right to use it, because if I used the evidence myself, I'd just become a target, and I was already old." "He didn't tell you to prepare an assessment in 2019, she said. "No." He set his mug down. "That was my own doing. I wanted to know if the numbers were still what they were. I wanted to know what she was worth." Nora said it carefully. Gus folded his hands around his mug. "Robert told me about the deposit the autumn before the trouble started. He told me, and one other man, a drill foreman who moved away in 1990 and hasn't been back. He trusted me because I'd worked for him 22 years and I'd never given him a reason not to. He told me about the deposit, and he told me about Stonebridge's approach, and he told me he was going to fight." He paused. "He told me something else, too. In the summer of 1989, for months after the mine closed, I got a letter from Charlotte." Nora sat forward. Gus went to the counter and opened a drawer and took out a small envelope, the kind used for personal letters, its edges soft with handling. He set it on the table between them. "She wrote to tell me she was all right and that she was going to stay gone the way her father had asked her to. She wrote to tell me she'd had a child in January, a girl, and that she'd named her Nora. She said she wasn't coming back. She said she hoped her father was still fighting." "He was," Nora said. Gus nodded slowly. "He died thinking Charlotte was somewhere building a life with her daughter. He didn't know Charlotte died in 1990. 1989, Nora said. "When I was 3. Gus looked at her. "She died in 1989, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He set down his mug carefully, as though it had become heavier. "I didn't know that," he said. The room was very still. Outside the kitchen window, the cottonwoods moved in the wind and made no sound through the glass. Nora looked at the table, at the topographic map with Hargrove Mountain at its center, at her own hands. She pulled out her wallet and opened it to the photograph and put it on the table beside the envelope. He looked at it for a long time. He took his reading glasses off his forehead and put them on and looked again. His jaw worked once, a small private movement. "That's Charlotte," he said. "The summer of 1987, most likely. She had a camera she'd bought at the hardware store in town that summer. She used to take pictures of the mine. She called it the family business, not meaning the mining exactly, meaning the whole mountain, the whole history of the thing." He took the glasses off again. He looked at Nora's face the way she had seen people look at things they already know but are not yet ready to say out loud. She put the key ring on the table next to the photograph. 2 keys, the large one and the small one. He looked at them. "You already went in," he said. It was not a question. She nodded. He let out a long breath that was not quite a sigh. It was the sound of something that has been held for a long time finally being allowed to move. Then he said, "You're Robert's granddaughter." She did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the photograph and the keys and the letter and all of it had not already said more plainly than words could. Gus sat for a while in the kitchen quiet with his hands around the cooling mug. The map of Harlan County was spread between them, the mountain at its center, the mine claim marked in the faded ink of a topographic line that said nothing about what was underneath. Finally, he said, "I know a lawyer. She's in Billings, and she is not connected to anything in this county. She worked a mining rights case 5 years ago that I followed in the state legal database, and she won it for a family that had no money and no connections against a company that had plenty of both." He looked up. "She will want to hear this story. I have 60 days on the taxes," Nora said. "Maybe less, now that Dale has been up to the mine." Gus shook his head slowly. "Dale being at the mine is actually good for you, if we move quickly. If he's been up there, he's nervous, which means he knows what the room contains. He's known for years, I'd wager." His father told him. They just couldn't access the room because they didn't have the key. They probably assumed it had been lost or destroyed. He looked at the key ring on the table. They didn't know Robert put it in the county archives. "Because they didn't think like Robert," Nora said. Gus almost smiled. Robert thought 30 years ahead on a good day. He built that room to last. He put the key where it would be preserved and transferable and exactly legal. He built a chain of custody that runs from him to the county deed system to whoever bought the mine at auction. He looked at her. "He built it for you, even though he didn't know your name." "Dale knew the room existed," Nora said. "He came looking for it today with someone else. They couldn't get in." "He's known for years," Gus said. His father Marcus told him at some point, before Marcus died. They knew Robert had sealed something. They knew the geological surveys existed because Robert had filed permit applications that referenced the discovery, and those applications were on record at the county, although the technical details of the discovery were not included in the public filing. What they never found was the key. Why didn't Dale just have someone break through the concrete wall? He could have. Gus was quiet for a moment. But if he broke in without legal authority to be there, any evidence he found would be his problem rather than his advantage. He'd be exposing himself to exactly the kind of scrutiny he spent his whole life avoiding. Marcus structured everything through official channels, through committee decisions and permit denials and administrative procedures, so there was never anything that looked explicitly like theft. It all looked like process. Dale learned that lesson. He would not break a door in a property he didn't legally own. He would find another way. "What way?" Nora said. Gus looked at her steadily. "The most likely way is the taxes. If you can't pay the $29,400 by the 60-day deadline, the county reclaims the property. Dale has county connections. He might find a way to purchase it through those channels before anyone notices it's back on the market. It would take him one phone call." 48 days, she said. He nodded. And she said, "Which is why tonight matters." He looked at the photograph of Charlotte on the table between them, and then at Nora, and then he reached for the phone. Nora looked at the photograph. At her mother laughing in front of the head frame in the summer of 1987, 2 months before she drove out of the valley and never came back. Before the trouble reached its worst. Before Robert sealed the room that was now unsealed. Before 29 years of solitude in a foster care system and a cracked radiator on a highway, and a yellow auction notice, and a key ring handed over a county clerk's desk for $320. She thought about Robert writing in his journal that he did not know where Charlotte was and needed to not know. She thought about him putting the envelope on the shelf of the sealed room with just her name on it. No address. Because he had no address. Because Charlotte had protected him by disappearing as completely as she could. She thought about the sealed room in the sealed mine on the sealed mountain, waiting. The name he gave her was Elena Vasquez. She was a mining rights attorney who had been practicing in Billings for 11 years, and who had won a mineral rights case against a major extraction company on behalf of a family from the eastern part of the state that most people in the legal community had considered unwinnable before it was won. Gus had read about the case in the State Mining Authority's newsletter, which he subscribed to out of a habit formed over 22 years underground. He had kept her name in the back of his address book, which was the kind of thing he did. He dialed. It was 8:15 in the evening. She answered on the third ring. Gus explained what he could in 3 minutes, which was not everything, but was enough. A family mine claim in Harlan County. A sealed room with 35 years of evidence in it. A genuine heir who had bought the property at auction with her last $320 and was currently living underground in the mine shaft. A 2019 mineral deposit assessment valuing a platinum group metal formation at $480 million at lower bound. Tax arrears with 48 days remaining. a county-connected developer who had been working to prevent the heir from establishing her claim, and who had been on the property that afternoon and was almost certainly making his own calls tonight. There was a pause on the other end of the call. Not a long pause. The pause of someone who has heard a lot of things in 11 years of practice and is calibrating what they are actually being told. Then Elena Vasquez said she would be in Copperhead by 10 o'clock the following morning. Gus set the phone down and looked at Nora across the table with an expression she had seen on the faces of people who have been carrying something alone for a long time and have been allowed to finally set it down. She looked back at him with the topographic map between them and the photograph of her mother on top of the map and the 2 keys from the mine claim deed beside it. And she thought about Robert Hargrove sitting in his office above the mine in August of 1988 with the geological survey in front of him and his hands flat on the desk and the weight of what he had found and what it was going to cost him pressing down from every direction. He had known it was going to cost him. He had built the sealed room anyway. He had put the key in the county archives and trusted the law to carry it forward until the right person came with the right claim. He had written a letter to whoever that person turned out to be and told them the mine was worth fighting for and that they should use what he had left them carefully and well. She had 48 days. She had the evidence, and a name in Billings, and a man sitting across the table who had kept faith with a dead man's instructions for 3 decades and was still willing to be useful. She picked up the photograph of her mother and put it back in her wallet, in the place between the worn cards where it had lived for as long as she could remember. Tomorrow was going to be the beginning of the part of this that actually cost something. She understood that. She also understood that she had been paying costs her entire life for something she had not yet received, and that the account was long since due. She looked at Gus. "I'll be here at 9, she said. He nodded once. She drove back to the mine in the dark and climbed down into the passage and lit the lantern and lay down on the plywood in her sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling of the upper level, 48 feet of rock between her and the sky. The journal was in her pack. The documents she had photographed on her phone before she left the sealed room were saved in 3 places. The keys were in her jacket pocket. Above her, Hargrove Mountain sat in the November dark the same way it had sat for 35 years. Patient. Sealed. Waiting for whatever came next. She closed her eyes. She was, she thought, exactly where she needed to be. Elena Vasquez arrived at 9:58 in a dark blue sedan that had seen a lot of Montana highway miles and wore them without apology. She was in her early 40s, compact and deliberate in the way she moved, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of eyes that conducted their own independent assessment of everything they landed on. She pulled into the gravel area beside Gus's carport, got out, looked at the mountain visible above the valley's north tree line for a moment, and then came to the door. Gus poured coffee. He had been up since 6, and the pot was fresh, and the kitchen table was clear of the topographic map that had been on it the night before, replaced by nothing, because Elena had told him on the phone that she would prefer to look at the documents themselves rather than summaries of them. Nora told the story from the beginning. She had told it twice the previous day, once to herself on the drive back from the mine after Dale's visit, running through it to make sure she had not missed anything or misread anything, and once to Gus. The third telling was the cleanest. She knew which details were necessary and which were background, and she gave Elena what was necessary without embellishment and without the kind of apologetic hedging she had noticed people use when they are telling a story they are afraid will not be believed. Elena did not interrupt. She took notes in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil, and when Nora was done, she looked at her notes for a moment and then looked up. "How long have you been living underground?" she asked. "For nights," Nora said. Elena wrote something else in the notebook. Then she said, "Let's go see the room." They drove to the mine in Elena's sedan, Nora directing her up the gravel track with the potholes and the washed-out sections that the sedan handled more carefully than the borrowed truck had. Gus rode in the back seat without talking. He had said most of what he needed to say the previous evening, and he was the kind of man who did not repeat himself unnecessarily. At the mine, Nora opened the ventilation shaft and went down first with the lantern. Elena followed, which said something about her. She was wearing sensible boots, and she climbed the rope ladder with the efficiency of someone who had done things that were more uncomfortable than this, and had not complained about those either. Gus came last, slower, taking the rungs with the deliberate care of a 71-year-old man who had spent 2 decades underground and still trusted his body to remember how. In the sealed room, Elena worked for 90 minutes. She read the geological surveys in the order they were filed, making notes. She read the 1988 report and the surveyor's margin calculation, and then she set it aside and looked at the ceiling for a moment with an expression that was not surprise, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a professional confirming a thing they had been told was true and finding that it was, in fact, true. She read Robert's journal. She read all of it, not skimming, taking her time with the entries that documented Stonebridge's escalation, annotating in her notebook as she went. When she reached the final letter to whoever came after, she read it without expression and then went back and read 2 pages of it again. She went through the financial box, checking each document against the others, verifying the notary seals, and the filing references and the chain of custody on the estate designation. She held the bearer bonds to the lantern light and looked at the serial numbers and the issuing bank stamp. She checked the stock certificates against a list she pulled up on her phone, company by company. 2 had dissolved. 3 had been acquired and absorbed into larger corporations, which meant the certificates had transformed into successor shares that were still valid and had accumulated decades of split and growth. The rest were active and in sectors that had performed well over 35 years. She set each one down after examining it with the care of someone who has learned not to show a reaction to numbers until she has verified that the numbers are what they appear to be. Then she sat down in the desk chair that Robert Hargrove had placed in this room 35 years ago and looked at Nora. "The estate document chain is intact," she said. "The Billings lawyer Robert used is deceased, but the firm still exists, and the filing is on record in the state probate system. I can access it before end of business today. The designation is Charlotte or lawful heir, which in the absence of a will or competing claim from Charlotte means you, if DNA confirms the lineage." "How long for DNA?" Nora asked. "She has a contact," Gus said from the doorway, not coming in. Elena nodded. "Private lab. 72 hours from sample to result. I'll need something of Charlotte's, or of Robert's. Either will establish the lineage from this direction." Gus said, "There's a hairbrush in the house. Charlotte left some things with me in 1989 when she was packing light and asked if she could pick them up later. She never came back for them." He said it plainly, without sentimentality, and the plainness of it was its own weight. Elena looked at the Stonebridge evidence box last, working through it methodically, cross-referencing the inspector reports against the permit applications, reading the correspondence with Earl Purvis twice. She documented everything on her phone, photographing each page in sequence. When she finished, she stood and looked at Gus. "Is Purvis still alive?" she asked. "He died in 2014, Gus said. She nodded once, filing that, and then looked at Nora. "The current lease arrangement for the mineral rights is the priority. Dale Stonebridge has been collecting royalty payments from a gravel extraction operation on the western edge of the Hargrove claim for 9 years, through a county administrative arrangement that his father set up in 2001, 8 years after Robert died, and the estate fell into limbo. The arrangement is legal in the narrow sense that the county had administrative authority over the abandoned claim, but it is built on the fraudulent foundation that Marcus Stonebridge erected in 1988 and 1989. We can challenge the entire structure." "How much has he collected?" Nora asked. Elena looked at the notes she'd made. "I'll need to see the county's full ledger, but based on the arrangement's terms and the gravel operations output over 9 years, I would estimate somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000. Nora said nothing. She was doing arithmetic. "I'll file 3 motions simultaneously this afternoon," Elena said. "Emergency stay on the tax repossession, which gives us more time and prevents Dale from maneuvering through county channels while the case is pending. Petition for heir recognition in the probate court in Billings, which is outside this county's jurisdiction and therefore outside the reach of anyone Dale has a relationship with here. And a motion for judicial review of the Stonebridge lease arrangement, which freezes the royalty payments and triggers a forensic audit." 3 in one afternoon, Nora said. Elena looked at her with something that might have been a slight smile. "You bought this property 4 days ago for $320. The person who put that money together is not someone who needs to be told to move quickly." They climbed out of the shaft and drove back to Copperhead, and Elena spent the afternoon at the table in Gus's kitchen with her laptop and her phone, filing in Billings and making calls to the State Mining Authority and to a geological consultant in Missoula whom she had used twice before. Nora sat at the table's other end and read through every document she had photographed on her phone, building her own timeline in the small notebook she carried for job estimates. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Elena's phone rang. She looked at the number, answered it, and listened for approximately 90 seconds. Then she said, "My client will not be taking meetings with counsel for Stonebridge properties at this time. If you have a settlement offer to convey, you can put it in writing and send it to my office." She ended the call. She looked at Nora. Dale's lawyers are offering $800,000 for a full release of all claims on the Hargrove property and all associated mineral rights. Nora looked at the table. $800,000 against a $480 million lower bound estimate. Elena said, "He knows what's down there." "Of course he does," Nora said. "His father knew in 1988. What does 800,000 tell us?" "It tells us he's afraid," Elena said. "Genuinely afraid. A confident man does not make an opening offer at 1/5 of 1% of the asset value. He's hoping you don't understand the numbers." "She told me to go back to sleeping in my car," Nora said. "At the auction." "He did." Elena picked up her pencil. "Then he made a mistake," she said. "People who assume they're talking to someone who doesn't understand things tend to skip the steps that are actually necessary." They documented the call. Elena prepared a formal response and sent it in writing. No settlement discussions until after the preliminary hearing. The hearing had been set for 11 days out by the court in Fielding, the fastest available date for an emergency stay petition with the complexity of supporting documentation they had filed. The story broke before the hearing. Nora did not know who had called the journalist. She suspected it was not Gus, who did not use the phone except when necessary, and not Elena, who did not speak to media during active proceedings. She suspected it was someone in the county clerk's office or in the court system in Billings, someone who had seen the filings come through and recognized the name Hargrove and understood what it meant in a county that had been living with that absence for 35 years. The state paper ran it on a Wednesday morning. Orphan girl discovers sealed mine room with $480 million platinum deposit. She bought the property for $320. Her phone, which she had not given to many people, started receiving calls from numbers she did not recognize. She let them go to voicemail. Patty called and left a message saying Nora's meals were on the house until further notice. Walt Gruber left a message that was an apology in the form of a description of himself as a man who should have done better, which she appreciated for its directness. 2 other messages were from people she barely knew, suddenly warm and interested in her well-being, and she listened to those more carefully, noting the quality of the warmth. She had a good memory and she did not spend energy on bitterness, but she also was not going to rewrite the past 8 months to make anyone comfortable. She called Patty back and thanked her and accepted the offer. She called Walt back and told him his apology was accepted and she hoped the new owners of the hardware store treated him fairly in the sale. She meant it. She did not call the others. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in Fielding on a Thursday morning when the temperature had dropped to single digits and the sky was the particular gray of a Montana winter that has fully committed. Elena drove. Gus rode in the back again. Nora sat in the front passenger seat and watched the highway run toward Fielding and thought about the last time she had driven this road, sitting in Walt's borrowed truck with $260 in her pocket and a feeling in her chest that she recognized now as the particular quality of someone who has decided to do something and has stopped calculating whether it is wise. The courthouse was a gray stone building set back from Fielding's main street with concrete steps going up to a set of heavy double doors. There were people on the steps, which surprised her until she understood that some of them had cameras. The state paper story had run 2 days ago. Others had picked it up. Elena moved through the crowd on the steps without stopping, her hand briefly on Nora's back to guide her through. Inside, the hallway was warm and smelled of old building heat and floor wax. Nora saw Dale Stonebridge in the hallway outside the courtroom door, standing with 3 men in suits whose collective hourly billing rate she guessed was more than she had earned in the previous 6 months. He looked at her once, directly. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. Inside, the courtroom was a medium-sized room with dark wood and high windows and a judge's bench that was occupied by a woman named the Honorable Patricia Doyle, who was in her mid-60s and who looked at the room over reading glasses with the patient economy of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people brought into her courtroom. The gallery was full. Nora had not expected that. She had not told anyone in Copperhead about the hearing date, but word had moved through the valley in the way that things move in small places where everyone knows what the others are paying attention to, and there were faces from town in the rows behind the bar. Patty was there, Calvin Marsh, Jerome from the library. Gus had of course come as a witness and was seated in the front row on their side of the room, his hands folded in his lap, wearing the flannel shirt and canvas jacket that appeared to be his one formal combination. Dale Stonebridge's legal team occupied the opposite table, for lawyers and two paralegals with matching folders and the practiced composure of people who are paid to appear untroubled. Elena presented the case in the organized and specific way of a lawyer who knows that the most effective argument is one that requires no ornamentation. She laid out the document chain from Robert's estate designation to the county property transfer to Nora's purchase. She laid out the geological surveys and their current market application, which the Missoula consultant, a broad-shouldered geologist named David Chun, who had driven up that morning, confirmed under examination with the technical precision of his field. He stated that the 2019 assessment he had reviewed was methodologically sound, and that the $480 million lower bound estimate was, if anything, conservative given developments in electric vehicle battery technology and the current demand curve for palladium. He was cross-examined by Dale's lead attorney on the reliability of a 35-year-old survey as the basis for any current valuation. Chun said that geological formations do not change meaningfully over 35 years, that the survey methodology was consistent with industry standard, and that the 12 core sample sites documented in the 1988 report represented a statistically sufficient basis for the estimated deposit size. He said it without impatience and with the particular authority of someone who does not need to argue because the facts are already on his side. Then Gus took the stand. He had told Nora the previous evening that he was not a man who liked formal proceedings, which she already knew, and that he intended to say what he had to say and nothing more. He said it. 22 years working the Hargrove Mine under Robert Hargrove's direct supervision. The specific Monday in August of 1988 when he could see in Robert's face that something had changed. The conversation Robert had with him that October, telling him about the discovery and about Stonebridge's approach. The instruction Robert gave him when he was dying in 1993, leave the key in the county archives and leave the room alone until someone comes with a legitimate claim, and then help them use what's in it. He said, Robert Hargrove was the most methodical man I ever worked for. He thought about the future the way other people think about tomorrow. He built that room for whoever came next because he knew whoever came next was going to need what was in it. Dale's lawyers cross-examined Gus on the 40-year gap between his conversations with Robert and his statement today, asking him to explain why he had not come forward with this information in the 31 years since Robert's death. Gus answered the question directly. He said he had been told to leave the room alone until someone with a legitimate claim came to it, and that he had done what he was told. And when Miss Vance bought the property at auction, the lawyer asked. Gus said, she had a legitimate claim. She just didn't know it yet. The gallery made a sound at that, brief and involuntary, and Judge Doyle did not need to use her gavel because it stopped itself. Dale's lawyers spent the next 40 minutes presenting their counterargument, which rested on 3 points. That the estate documents were too old to be verifiable without extensive additional authentication. That the geological surveys required independent corroboration before any market valuation could be responsibly cited, and that the connection between Nora Vance and the Hargrove family was as yet unconfirmed by any biological evidence. These were not unreasonable points in isolation, and the lead attorney made them well, with the careful, measured tone of someone who has practiced making the weaker position sound like the reasonable one. He did not mention Marcus Stonebridge by name. He characterized the lease arrangement as routine county administrative procedure. Elena's rebuttal was 3 minutes long. She noted that the estate documents carried the notary certification of a licensed professional whose records were on file with the state bar and whose identity and credentials were fully verifiable, that the geological survey had already been confirmed by an independent expert present in the courtroom, and that DNA testing was already underway with results expected within 90 days. Which was why she was asking for a stay rather than a final judgment. She also noted, without elaboration, that the lead attorney had spent 40 minutes arguing about document authentication without addressing the specific content of the documents, which included detailed records of a scheme to deny the Hargrove family its mineral rights through manipulation of the county permit process. Judge Doyle called a recess at noon and returned at 1:45. Nora testified last. She had thought about how to approach the testimony and had decided, with Elena's agreement, to say exactly what had happened in exactly the order it happened, with no interpretation and no editorializing, because the sequence of events did not require either. She described buying the property at auction. She described finding the ventilation shaft and descending. She described the door and the key and the room and what was in it. She described reading the journal and standing at the base of the head frame and understanding what the photograph in her wallet had been showing her for her entire life. Dale's lawyers asked her to explain how a person with no mining experience, no legal knowledge, and no family connections had managed to acquire a $480 million mining claim for $320, and whether she could see how that might raise questions about whether the acquisition had been genuinely independent or had been arranged with assistance from parties who had prior knowledge of the claim's value. She said she had bought a $320 property with the last money she had because she needed somewhere to sleep in November that was warmer than a shed. A few people in the room behind her made a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite anything else. Elena's redirect was 2 questions. She asked Nora whether anyone had told her the sealed room existed before she discovered it. Nora said no. She asked whether anyone had told her she might be the Hargrove heir before she read Robert's journal. Nora said no. Judge Doyle called a recess at noon and returned at 1:45. She granted the emergency stay on the tax repossession. She granted preliminary recognition of Nora's status as Charlotte Hargrove's heir, contingent on DNA confirmation within 90 days, noting that the estate documentation chain was in her assessment complete and legally sound. She ordered a full forensic audit of all revenue collected under the Stonebridge lease arrangement going back to its inception in 2001. And she referred the Stonebridge fraud evidence to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal violations. She looked at the courtroom over her reading glasses before adjourning and said that in her 31 years on the bench, she had seen property disputes of considerable complexity, but that she wanted to say for the record that the documentation Robert Hargrove had prepared and sealed in 1989 was the most complete single-person evidentiary package she had encountered in a case of this type, and that it was, in her opinion, a remarkable act of foresight for a man facing circumstances that would have led most people to focus on the immediate rather than the future. The gavel came down. In the parking lot outside the courthouse, the people with cameras were waiting. Elena steered Nora past most of them and toward the car. Nora saw Dale Stonebridge standing beside his truck at the far end of the lot. He was alone, his lawyers apparently still inside or already gone. He was looking at her. She stopped walking. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he got into his truck and drove out of the parking lot without a word. She watched the truck reach the street and turn and disappear. She stood in the courthouse parking lot in the single-digit cold and felt what she actually felt, which was not triumph and not relief exactly, though both of those were present somewhere in it. What she felt most clearly was the quiet, specific sensation of a weight that had been present for so long she had stopped registering it, as weight finally becoming absent. She had come into this valley because a radiator cracked. She had stayed because leaving would have cost more than staying. She had bought a mountain for $320 because she needed somewhere to sleep that was hers. She had gone underground in November and found something that had been waiting for exactly the person she turned out to be. She got into Elena's car. Gus was already in the back seat, looking out the window at the courthouse with an expression she could not see fully from the front. She said, "Thank you, Gus." He said, "It was Robert who built the room." She said, "You kept it. For 30 years, you kept it." He did not say anything to that. He looked out the window for a moment, and then he said, "Let's go get something to eat. I know a place in Fielding that makes a decent bowl of soup." If you are still with us at this point in the story, please hit that like button and smash subscribe, because we have more stories coming that are every bit as powerful as this one. Do not go anywhere. The DNA results came back 68 days after the hearing, which was 3 weeks earlier than the 90-day window Judge Doyle had allowed. Elena called Nora on a Tuesday morning when Nora was at the mine checking on the stabilization work that a structural engineer from Billings had begun on the head frame. The probability of maternity from Charlotte's hairbrush sample to Nora's DNA was 94%. Elena filed the confirmation that afternoon. The estate designation became final on the 30th of that month. The Hargrove Mining claim, the mineral rights, the 4 property deeds, the bearer bonds, the stock certificates, and the right to all revenues from any extraction on the claim were legally and formally Nora Vance Hargrove's. The forensic audit of the Stonebridge lease arrangement ran simultaneously and produced a number, $512,000 in royalty payments collected by Stonebridge Properties from 2001 to the present, from a gravel extraction operation that had been run on the western edge of the Hargrove claim using a county administrative arrangement that the auditors described as without valid legal basis given the fraudulent foundation of the original Stonebridge-era actions. The Attorney General's office filed criminal fraud charges against Dale Stonebridge in February, and his lawyers reached a settlement in April that required the return of the full $512,000 with interest, the formal surrender of all claims against the Hargrove property, and a civil penalty that Nora, with Elena's guidance, designated to the Harlan County Community Development Fund. Dale did not go to prison. He was convicted of fraud and received a suspended sentence and 3 years of supervised probation. He sold the Stonebridge Properties office building in Fielding to pay the settlement. Whether he understood, fully, what had been done to him by the girl he had dismissed in an auction room with a $300 bid, Nora did not know and did not spend time considering. She had other things to do. In Copperhead, the response to the story's full emergence was the kind of response that small towns produce when something large and undeniable has happened in their midst. People who had looked through Nora for 8 months now looked directly at her. People who had spoken about her in voices pitched carefully below direct address now spoke about her in voices that were warm and specific and occasionally embarrassing in their revision of the past. She handled all of it the same way she had handled the dismissal, with a steadiness that did not require the performance of either bitterness or forgiveness, because she had no interest in performing either. She was the same person who had fixed their leaky faucets and cleaned Patty's kitchen for $7 an hour and slept in a shed behind the hardware store. They were seeing her clearly now that circumstances made it easy to do so. She did not fault them for being people. There was a particular conversation she had with a man named Roy Sellers, who had been one of the 2 men in the copper tap booth behind her the evening she overheard the discussion about her kind of rootlessness and what it meant. Roy stopped her outside the post office one morning, hat in his hands, and apologized in the specific halting way of a man who has thought about what he wants to say and still cannot fully find the words for it. He said he had not known who she was, and that he wished he had treated her better regardless of who she was. She told him she accepted the apology. She told him that not knowing who a person is has never been a good reason to treat them poorly, and that she hoped he would think about that going forward in the way he couldn't have going backward. She said it without heat. He nodded and put his hat back on, and they went their separate ways, and she thought that was probably the most useful version of that conversation that either of them was going to get. Patty Reed was the exception. She had been kind when kindness was not required, and she was kind the same way now, without adjustment. Nora ate at the diner most mornings through the winter, and they talked across the counter the way 2 women talk when they have established a rapport and do not need to perform it. Calvin Marsh at the gas station shook her hand one morning and said he was glad things had worked out, and she told him she was glad too, and that was all that needed to be said between them. One evening in early December, after the DNA confirmation had come in and the estate was formally hers, but before the development agreement had been finalized, Nora went back to the sealed room alone. She had been in it a dozen times since the morning she first opened the door, with Elena, with Gus, with the geological consultant, and the structural engineer, and eventually with the Attorney General's investigator who needed to photograph the Stonebridge evidence in place before it was transferred to official custody. Each time she had been there in the company of someone who had a professional reason to be there and a specific task to accomplish. This time she brought the lantern and sat down at the metal desk and opened the strongbox and took out the envelope addressed to Charlotte. She had not opened it until now. She had looked at it many times. She had considered opening it on the first day and decided against it, not because she thought she shouldn't, but because she wanted to wait until the noise and urgency of the legal proceedings had settled enough for her to read it properly, until she could give it her full attention. She opened it now. The paper was heavier than notebook paper, the good stationery that people used when they intended a letter to last. The ink was faded to brown, but completely legible. Robert's block printing, careful as ever. Charlotte, he wrote. I don't know where you are when you read this. I don't know how much time has passed since you left the valley. I told you not to write, and you didn't. Which I am glad of, because it means you understood why I asked you not to, and you respected it. I hope it also means you have built something worth protecting. I want you to know that the mine is secure. What we found last summer is real, and it is ours. The evidence of that, and of everything Stonebridge has done, is in this room with this letter. I sealed it well. I believe it will last. I want you to tell your child about this place someday, when it is safe to do so. I want them to know they come from people who built something from raw rock and did not let it be taken without a fight. The fight I'm in right now may not go the way I want it to. I am not naive about that. But the room is sealed and the evidence is here, and the key is in a place where the law will carry it forward until someone with the right to use it comes along. If it is you who comes, the mine is yours. Take it. Use it well. If it is not you, if something has happened, then it is whoever you chose to raise, or whoever the state raised in your absence. I don't know which. I pray it is you. But if it is not, then whoever is reading this in your place is a Hargrove whether they know it or not. And this mine and everything in it is theirs, and I would like them to know from me directly that they were always wanted, even when they could not be found, even when I could not risk looking. There is more to this life than what Stonebridge did to it. I want you to know that too. There were years here that were good years, full years. Your mother in this valley when she was young. You in the summers when you were small, following me down the mine road, collecting rocks from the tailings pile, because you wanted to understand what the mountain was made of. I have kept those years in my mind the way you keep things you know you are going to need later. I love you, Charlotte. I love whoever you became. I love whoever you chose to bring into this world. Bring them home to the mountain when it is safe. The mountain will still be here. Your father, Robert Hargrove, March 14th, 1989. Nora sat with the letter for a long time in the dry, sealed air of the room her grandfather had built for her without knowing her name. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in her jacket pocket, next to the photograph. The development agreement was signed in early spring with a mining company based in Butte that had the capital and the technical capacity to bring a deep-level platinum group metal extraction to production, which was a multi-year process involving additional geological work and permitting that Nora, with Elena's counsel, was careful to structure correctly. The agreement was not a sale. Nora retained ownership of the claim and the mineral rights. The company was a contractor, operating under a royalty arrangement that she had spent 2 weeks with Elena reviewing line by line before she signed it. The royalty structure included a community benefit clause that dedicated 8% of net revenues to Harlan County, designated specifically for Copperhead, in the form of a fund that was administered by a board Nora appointed. The first 3 board members were Gus Dalton, Patty Reed, and a retired schoolteacher named Alice Farnsworth who had taught in Copperhead for 30 years and who Gus had recommended without being asked. The mine would bring work back to the valley. Not the same work as before, not the copper and silver crews of the Hargrove operation, but new work, extraction, and support, and the downstream employment that comes when money moves through a small economy instead of past it. Copperhead, which had been losing population for 35 years, would not reverse that trend immediately. But it would stop, and then it would turn. The Hargrove Legacy Fund was Nora's idea, and she had been thinking about it since the first night she spent in the mine passage, lying in the sleeping bag on the plywood sheet, which was before she knew about the deposit or the sealed room or any of it, when all she had was a mountain and $22 and a practical understanding of what it meant to grow up without anywhere that was yours. The fund provided college scholarships and transitional housing assistance and job training stipends for young people aging out of the Montana foster care system. The first-year budget was $1 million, drawn from the estate's liquid assets, the bearer bonds, and the stock certificates that Elena had marshaled through the probate court. The first round of applications received 47 submissions. They funded 22. Gus came to the small ceremony Nora held at Patty's to announce the fund. He sat at the counter with a cup of coffee and watched the room fill with more people than the diner could comfortably hold, which is the particular kind of crowd that assembles when a thing people have been hoping for without expecting it actually arrives. He did not make a speech. When Nora caught his eye across the room, he raised his cup in a gesture that was small and complete and said everything that needed to be said between them without requiring a word. She had asked him 3 weeks before the ceremony if he would serve as the mine's historian and community liaison, which was a role she had made up for the specific purpose of giving him a formal reason to do what he was already doing, which was being the memory of the place and the bridge between what it had been and what it was becoming. He had accepted with the particular lack of ceremony that characterized every significant thing he had ever agreed to. He had also accepted the key ring. She had given it back to him at the end of their first meeting with Elena, when she understood that the key had passed through his keeping before it passed through the county archives, and that there was something right about him holding it again. He had looked at it for a moment and then put it in the pocket of his flannel shirt and said nothing. She knew it was in good hands. On a morning in late April, 6 months after she had first descended the shaft in the November dark with a lantern and a rope ladder and nothing else, Nora stood at the top of the ventilation shaft opening and looked out at the valley below. The head frame had been stabilized by the structural engineers and treated against further weathering. It stood straight now against the morning sky, the rusted iron and old timber clean and solid, looking more like itself than it had in decades. The surface around the shaft entrance had been cleared and graveled, the tailings drift tidied, the collapsed processing building's debris moved back and assessed for what could be preserved. The mine road had been regraded and was passable without four-wheel drive. Below in the valley, Copperhead was visible as a cluster of buildings between the ridgelines, the main street legible from up here as a gray line with a few vehicles moving along it. The copper tap sign was visible from the mine road. The hardware store's roof was visible. The cottonwoods on the east side of town, the ones over Gus's house, were just beginning to come out in the particular light green of early spring that lasts about a week before it deepens into summer green. She had been living in a rented room in town since December, a proper room in a house owned by an older woman named Ruth who rented 2 rooms and who cooked dinner most evenings, and had not asked Nora a single question about her circumstances beyond whether she preferred the room facing east or the room facing west. She had taken the east room because it faced the mountain. She stood at the top of the shaft for a while before going down. The morning was still and cold enough to see her breath, and the sky above the ridge line was the particular clear blue that arrives in Montana in the gap between winter and spring, when the season has not yet committed to warmth but has stopped being purely cold. Below her the valley was beginning its slow annual return to itself, the brown and gray of winter giving way at the edges to the first tentative green. The creek she had been filtering water from since November was running full with snowmelt. She could hear it from the mine road, a continuous sound that had been absent all winter under the ice. She thought about what the mountain would look like in 5 years when the extraction operation was running, when the ventilation shaft had been replaced by proper access infrastructure and the processing equipment was in place and the employment roles had people on them from the valley below. She thought about the first scholarship recipients from the Hargrove Legacy Fund, 22 young people in the Montana foster system who had received letters in March telling them their college costs were covered. She thought about Gus coming to the mine 2 or 3 days a week, walking the upper level with the structural engineers, pointing out what he remembered from 22 years of shifts, his knowledge of the place's history, the kind of knowledge that no engineer's survey can fully replace. She thought about the first check from the Community Benefit Fund arriving at Copperhead's town hall in the fall, the first actual money the valley had seen from Hargrove Mountain since 1989. She thought about Robert writing in the sealed room in March of 1989, the mine road quiet outside, and the valley below, and the fight he was losing in the only venue available to him, and putting the pen down and folding the letter to Charlotte, and sealing it, and putting it on the shelf. He had been right that the mountain was worth fighting for. He had been right that someone would come. He had been right about almost everything, and the one thing he had gotten wrong, that his daughter might still be alive when that someone arrived, was not something he could have known and not something she held against him. She picked up the lantern from the ground beside the shaft opening and held it for a moment, not lit, just in her hand. She had spent 4 nights in the dark underground in November with this lantern burning between her and the cold, and that had been enough to start everything that came after. It had always been enough, starting from wherever you are with what you actually have. That was the only arithmetic that had ever worked for her, and it had brought her here, to the top of a mountain in late April with a valley below her and a grandfather's letter in her pocket and a fight that was won. She set the lantern down and looked at the valley one more time. Then she climbed down. She climbed down the shaft one more time. She was not going to the sealed room. The sealed room was no longer hers in the same way it had been during those first days when it was the center of everything, the whole purpose, the thing the keys unlocked. The geological consultants and the development company's engineers had been through it many times now, working from the survey data, planning the extraction access. The documents were in the Attorney General's office and the probate court and Elena's files and 3 encrypted digital copies on servers in Billings, Missoula, and a cloud service she did not think about too precisely. The evidence was safe. The room had done what Robert built it to do. She walked the main passage with the lantern, slowly, the way she had walked it the first time when she was mapping it against the library diagram. The timber supports still stood at their intervals. The plank floor still carried her weight. The rail tracks still ran down the center. The passage was the same as it had been in November and the same as it had been in 1989 when Robert sealed it and climbed out for the last time, and the same as it had been through all the decades before that when it was a working mine and men walked this passage on their shifts with lamps on their helmets and the hum of machinery somewhere below. She stopped at the place where she had set up her sleeping space in November, the widened section 60 feet from the shaft entrance with the flat ledge cut into the west wall. The plywood sheet was still there, leaning against the wall where she had moved it when the lawyers and engineers started coming through. The lantern peg was still in the timber support. She had spent 4 nights in this spot knowing nothing about what the mine contained, only that it was warmer than anywhere else available to her, and that it was hers. She stood there for a while. She thought about the specific quality of those 4 nights, the particular feeling of being underground in the dark with $22, and a practical calculation about temperature and a stubbornness that had nothing yet to attach itself to. She had not known what was in the South Passage. She had not known about the sealed room or the surveys or the deposit or her grandfather or any of it. She had known only that she had bought this property with her last money, and she was going to be in it rather than outside it. That had been enough. It had always been enough, this quality of deciding to be inside a thing rather than outside it, to occupy the space available even when the space was dark and cold and 50 feet underground. She had made that choice her whole life, in every placement and every shed and every borrowed truck and every $7 shift at a diner counter, and it had brought her here. She stopped at the North Branch entrance and looked down the dead-end passage for a moment. The backfill at the end was still there. The place where she had pressed herself flat in the dark while Dale's flashlight swept past was just a section of floor, indistinguishable from any other section. She walked the South Passage to the door. She stood in front of it with the lantern held up, looking at the steel surface and the gray concrete block around it, the painted door that had been invisible until she was the specific person looking at it with the specific quality of attention she had developed out of a lifetime of noticing things that other people had decided not to notice. Her grandfather had built this room for her. He had not known her name or her face or what she would be like when she arrived. He had known that someone would come, someday, with the right claim and the right attention and the particular stubbornness required to take what was theirs in the face of people who had more and had decided that entitled them to more still. He had believed that person would come and had built accordingly. She was the person. The room had been waiting for her. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the photograph. Her mother in the summer of 1987, laughing at the camera, the head frame visible in the background. A year before the discovery. 2 months before Robert sent her away for her own safety. Before the trouble, in the good years her grandfather had written about. The years he had kept in his mind because he knew he was going to need them later. Nora looked at the photograph for a moment, and then she put it back in her pocket, next to the letter. She turned the lantern off. In the absolute darkness of the mine, 50 feet below the spring morning and the stabilized head frame and the valley with the town in it, she stood still for a while and listened to the mountain, which was the same deep silence she had listened to for 4 nights in November when she was a girl with $22 and nowhere to go who had decided, in the deliberate and practical way she decided everything, that going down was better than staying up. She had been right about that. She had been right in the specific way of someone who pays attention and does the arithmetic correctly and does not talk herself out of a conclusion because it is unusual. She climbed out into the light. Some things worth having are buried so deep that only the person with a real reason to go looking will ever find them. Some things can only be found by someone who has spent so long dismissed and overlooked that they have developed the particular quality of attention that comes from always being the one in the room who cannot afford to miss anything. Nora Vance Hargrove had bought a mountain for $320 and gone underground in November and found what her grandfather had sealed in the dark for exactly the person she turned out to be. Not because she was lucky, not because the universe arranged itself for her, because she paid attention when everyone around her had decided she was not worth paying attention to. That quality of attention, which is not taught and cannot be bought, was what the sealed room had been waiting for. It was what the mine was worth. Everything else was rock. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.